Hello, everyone. Happy New Year. Welcome to 2021. Glad to have you here. This is our first stay-at-home lecture for the new year. I'm glad to have you all here. We're having a few more people come in, so if you see me leaning into the screen, that's me letting the people in. And I'm glad to have you all here today. Just a little bit about just to tell you a little bit about this lecture series. It is sponsored by the Society for the History of Medicine and the Health Professions, which is a friends organization for the Historical Research Center at UAMS. And the Historical Research Center is the archives division of UAMS. We're located in the UAMS library, and we collect all types of materials that tell the history of the medical professions and the other health professions in Arkansas. So we are the only archives in the state dedicated to that mission of preserving the health sciences history in the state. So with that, we collect books, photographs, correspondence, artifacts, anything that documents that unique history that we have in our state. So if you do have something that you're interested in donating to us, or perhaps you're not sure of something that we might be interested in, I hope you'll contact me, and I'd love to talk with you about it. The Society, as I mentioned, is the friends organization for the Historical Research Center. They sponsor these stay-at-home lectures, which occurs every first Thursday of the month. And we have the dues for the society are very inexpensive, so I'd like to encourage you to join. There's a PayPal link up on your screen, and I encourage you to join. The dues for an individual are $15 for students. No matter where you are, you don't have to be a student at UAMS. Is $5. So please go to that. If you'd like more information about the society, you can go to the UAMS library webpage and also look it up there. Tonight, I am glad to welcome my friend Jerry Hogan, goes by JB Hogan. He is an author and local historian from Fayetteville. He is past president of the Washington County Historical Society from 2013 to 2015, and he is currently completing work on his book, Forgotten Fayetteville and Washington County, due out in October of 2021. I'm going to turn it over to Jerry, but before I do, I want to, if you have any questions, use the chat feature, type it in the chat box, and we will hopefully get to them at the end of the presentation. So with that being said, I am going to turn off my video, mute myself, and turn it over to Jerry. So Jerry, welcome.
Thanks, Tim. Can everybody hear me, I hope? So you probably can answer. So anyway, before we get going, before I put my PowerPoint up there, I want to thank Tim and you all for being here. I want to thank Tim for setting this up, and for the Society for the History of Medicine and Health Professions for doing this. I also want to thank two other people. Jennifer Carter is a school librarian, got me dozens of newspaper clippings that helped me in the research. As everybody knows, it's a difficult time to research right now with the pandemic going on. Also want to thank Amy Nelson Lamont, the Fayetteville Public Library reference librarian, who got me all the books that I was able to get to read about the pandemic, the 1918 influenza. Now I'm going to try to share my PowerPoint here. And I'll go to our slideshow. There we go. So now, if I move the cursor around, Zoom has shown itself to be really delicate. So I may move around more than I want to. But anyway, this is the title photograph on the title slide. And it's the Armistice Day in Fayetteville on the north side of the square in 1918. And I'm going to come back to this picture later on, but I wanted to use it because it makes the point I want to make, which is that the 1918 influenza, which you also is known as the Spanish flu or Spanish influenza incorrectly, is a World War I story. The influenza horribly affected our military and all over the world, and then the civilian world as well. But it happened during the last year of the war and in the aftermath of the war. And to begin, I'm going to do two background slides, and I'll try not to belabor anything too much. So I wanted to give a little bit of overall background before we get going on the Fayetteville part. Okay, so the 1918 influenza background. First of all, it's not really the Spanish flu. That's a misnomer. And rather than me stumbling around on the words, let me read from an article called the Disaster Medicine 1918 Influenza.
I mean, I don't know how to sound it.
By Dr. Andrew Milston. And these are his words. It was called the Spanish flu because it was first officially noticed in Spain in May of 1918. Spain was neutral in World War I and is one of the only countries with a reliable press at that time, so they reported the flu earlier than other countries. So the flu did not originate there, but they were not censored by their military and government during that time, so they were able to report on it, and so it became known as the Spanish flu. If you're doing research, you'll find as much stuff with Spanish flu as you will 1918, but I'm going to go with a more accurate name. Okay, origin theories of where it came from. There are three of them, and one involves Chinese workers traveling back and forth to the United States, and another is in France with French soldiers. But the one that most of the books, most of the commentators agree is the most likely origin is in fact here in the United States in the little county, Haskell County, Kansas, southwest of Dodge City. I'm going to move my cursor over here. See in the little picture down here, the yellow block, that's Haskell County, and the red arrow pointing down to it. Dodge City is about, if you can see my cursor, about in there. And later I'm going to talk about Camp Funston and Camp Riley, and they're up around Junction City and Manhattan in this area over in here of Kansas, in the northeast Kansas. Okay. So in January and February of 1918, there was an outbreak of a very virulent influenza. And this doctor, whose picture you see here, Dr. Loring Minor in Haskell County, he treated the people and he saw that it was something different, something more deadly, something more powerful. And he actually warned the United States Public Health Service, sent him a letter, and because of the war and everything else, they just kind of, it slipped away. They didn't notice it. Anyway, the transmission method, just as COVID-19 is, the 1918 influenza was an avian flu. That is, it came from birds. I don't know what bird in 1918. I believe bats are the source of our COVID-19. And then they get transmitted to humans. And this one in 1918 was possibly transmitted from the birds to pigs to human beings. And apparently our systems don't react well at all to avian flus. They're the two worst pandemics of 1918 and now have both been avian flus. Okay, and now the next thing, so we go to wave one of the 1918 pandemic is from March 11th is the date given. Some people say March 4th, but most people say March 11th, and it lasted through the summer of 1918. And ground zero is Camp Funston. It's part of what was then the Camp Riley complex in Kansas, which is up near Junction City and Manhattan. And it is now Fort Riley. Now, Fort Riley, if you're familiar with military kind of things, Fort Riley is a permanent party position. That is, you're assigned there after you've done your training or whatever. Camp Funston was like a basic training area, and it's about 5 miles from Fort Riley. And it was put in there to handle the tens of thousands of soldiers that were being trained to fight in World War I. And I got this picture down there. Look at the size of it. I'm sure that most of those buildings in the foreground there are barracks at Camp Funston. Okay, so now we got ground zero is Camp Funston, and the patient zero was a Private Albert Gitchell, cook at Camp Funston. He reported the sick bay on March 11th, 1918, with its symptoms, fever, achiness, headache, chills, all those kind of things. And by noon of that day, 107 more GIs went to sick bay. And by the end of the week, there were 522. And the end of March, 1,100 had reported sick and 48 men had died. And I don't know if you can see it as well down on the right side. There's a picture of one of those big buildings here at Camp Funston turned into a giant hospital there, and you can see all the soldiers lying there. And maybe this is a good time, if I didn't say it already when I was started, but yeah, I think I did, but I just want to reiterate, the influenza went through our military. I don't know how to describe it, just absolutely devastated our military. When I get to the end of the talk, I'll have some more overall numbers on everything, but it really, really hammered our military big time, and it did, and then eventually into the civilian world as well. Okay, those are the two background slides on that. Now we go, okay, so my transition is that if Camp Funston was ground zero for the pandemic, then ground zero for the pandemic in Fayetteville was the University of Arkansas. And it was wave 2 that hit Arkansas. And you might have read or seen this before. They believe now, some people believe now, that wave 2, it's the most virulent and the most deadly one of the waves. Wave 2 was caused by a mutation of the virus, and that's why it was so deadly. Okay, so summer and fall of 1918, we have this, in early 1918, the Department of War created what was called the Student Army Training Corps, the SATC. The SATC was to replace ROTC, and it did so on 525 campuses. So it was a big project. And so what happened was on these campuses that the universities became military enclaves. They were commanded, if you will, by military and the civilian. So at the University of Arkansas, Major George E. Martin was in charge of the Student Army Training Corps side, and U of A President John C. Futrell had this regular U of A student side. You might know President Futrell. He was the longest serving president of the University of Arkansas. He served from 1913 to 1939 when he was killed in a car wreck outside West Fork, coming back from a conference or meeting down in Little Rock. And these pictures are from the U of A Razorback 1919, which is an incredible source of information and photographs, in particular in this case. Okay, so that's the first one on the SATC. So in June 15th, the first detachment of 310 young men arrived at the U of A campus. What they were doing was they came in as privates, $30 a month, and they were training and also taking classes. And was it 2 months later, a second detachment of 300 came in. Most of those young guys were from Oklahoma. And so by late September, there's about 600 to 800 of these SAT men at the U of A. Here's a point I want to make too. In my numbers here, a lot of times these numbers, you'll see a variation. It's because I get different numbers from different sources. So I just I try to, ballpark it, if you will, or get an average of it. Now, what I wanted to show you here before I move on this one is down in this photograph, down here at the bottom, you can see pictures of the guys training at the U of A, and you see these two great big barracks. They created about 4 or 5 temporary barracks down, if you're familiar with Fayetteville, down at the corner of Dixon and Arkansas Avenue. They created some temporary ones there. These great big ones were to get you oriented. Once again, if you're familiar with Mullins Library on the U of A campus, if you come out the door facing the Student Union, these big barracks would have been to your right, kind of leading over to where the law school is today. And I thought it was great to get a picture of those barracks and show you here. Okay, so here's some more information. October the 1st, the regular students arrived, and the newspaper said there was 1,000 on campus and expected 1,400. The problem I have here is I don't know how many, the ratio here. Now, it's the U of A enrollment during that time was between 750 and 850. So I'm going to guess around 800 to go along with the years on either side of it. So it's maybe about half and half, or a little more students than soldier students. I'm not sure. Anyway, so almost immediately, and now the newspapers blame the students arriving, but it seems to me, and because the soldiers took the biggest brunt of this, I think it may have been percolating a little bit on the campus before. I can't prove that to you yet, but I believe that to be the case. Anyway, on October the 3rd, the University of Arkansas put them on a 24-hour quarantine. And I want to read you a real quick thing there from President Futuro, was in the paper. The quarantine is merely a precautionary measure against any possible spread of Spanish influenza, Dr. Futuro said. It will be strictly enforced and no one will be admitted to this campus without a pass. That's one of the odd things about this, having these enclaves at the time, is that you can only get on the U of A campus from the southeast entrance there at Dixon and Arkansas Avenue, and you had to have a pass going either way. So bottom line with this quarantine is the U of A had to delay opening their classes. And on October the 7th, they did that. By October the 9th, I got two different sources here, between 235 and 337 influenza cases on the campus of the University of Arkansas. You can see that's a very large percentage. I don't know how it affected the students so much, but I do know that one report said that there were 54 young women that had the influenza and they were in Carnell Hall. But as I will talk about later, the only deaths were in the SATC men. Okay, so while this is all going on, at the U of A infirmary, we're getting all these young men in there that are sick as can be, and they're trying to take care of them in the fall, and I call this on the front lines. And the superintendent of the U of A infirmary then was a lady named Nina Harden. They called her Ma. I don't think, you would think that'd be some older lady or something. I'm not sure she was all that old. But anyway, she was called Ma Harden. And there, I think, is an absolutely wonderful photograph of the U of A infirmary. This is the next year from the thing, and you see the grass is all grown up. But that little building, again, if you're familiar with the U of A campus, sat about at the eastern end of the law school, right? The backside would be Maple. On the backside of that building would be Maple Street behind it. The second lady that was helping on the front lines that got a lot of credit, I should say, there's lots more, was a lady named Belle Blanchard. She was from Fayetteville. Her family had a home on North College here. She was a Red Cross nurse who worked at the infirmary. And Miss Blanchard, on October the 4th and 5th, put a notice in the Fayetteville paper asking people in town, because there were so many people sick, to please give them bed sheets, pillows, anything to help the people in the hospital, the infirmary. And she also asked for 50, I haven't said this yet, and I'll probably say it later. Fayetteville only had 5,000 people at the time. They asked for 50 ladies to come help the nurses take care of all these sick people. And she did that on the 4th and the 5th. And one of the ladies among the 50 who answered the call was Mrs. Laura Lighton. She was the wife of Will Lighton, the mom of Louis Duryea Bud Lighton. And if you guys have, by any chance, have seen my local history videos, the Lightons are one of my favorite families ever in Fayetteville. They were friends with Will Rogers. The dad's book was made into Will Rogers' 4th film. Just an incredible family, talented, did all kinds of things in town. Anyway, so Mrs. Lighton was one of the people who answered the call. And I'd like to read you a little passage here from President Futuro, again, talking about these ladies and Mrs. Lighton in particular. He says, but of all the examples of the sacrifice and charity of ordinary citizens that can be cited, few shine as brightly as the heroism shown by the women of Fayetteville who helped nurse the ailing soldiers of the Student Army Training Corps. While afterwards praising the efforts of Laura Lighton and the other volunteers, President Futuro concluded that without question it was due in large part to their unselfish devotion that the epidemic was mastered in so short a time. So that's in this case, the women on the front lines. Okay, so now it's time for the town of Fayetteville in wave 2. So as I said just a minute ago, I wanted to make sure that I let you know how small Fayetteville was at the time. The population was 5,000. So you can see it probably things could be controlled a good deal easier than what are we, like 85,000 now, something like that. Anyway, so what I want to do here is on October the 5th, in Fayetteville, they were going to have a Liberty Loan Parade. It was actually called the Liberty Loan Women in War Work Parade and Program. These were programs where women paraded and they collected money for the war effort. It's, in our big wars, we had all kind of efforts like this to get money to fight the wars. Well, the reason I brought this one up, it was called off on the 5th because on September, and I think because of this, on September the 28th in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, they had exactly one of these parades. And when they got done with that parade in Philly, it was, thousands and thousands of people. 750 people died from that parade that were at that parade from the influenza. So you talk about a super spreader. And so Fayetteville was very smart to cancel that one. Get the little thing to move forward. Okay, so on October the 7th, the Arkansas State Department of Health issued a quarantine request, issued a quarantine for the state. This is from the October the 8th newspaper. And I'm going to read you just the first part because it might be hard to read. The orders issued Monday by the State Board of Health closing churches, schools, and theaters and prohibiting the gathering of crowds of persons at other places was a drastic one, but was considered necessary in view of the widespread epidemic of influenza. The disease has spread rapidly and beyond the fears of even the most pessimistic. So you might see some parallels there that people are trying to see the positive side and the good side, but the virus has its own rules and follows those. And this one was terrible. Not that this one isn't, but this had 100 years less of medical expertise. Okay, so wave 2 Fayetteville timeline continued. So the very next day, Fayetteville goes under quarantine. They issue a quarantine. W.N. Yates was our head of our Board of Health, but it was issued by W.J. Reynolds, secretary. And I think this is the last one I'm going to read to you. I want to read you that notice because it's probably hard to read these newspaper clippings. The notice says, at a special meeting of the City Board of Health, an order was issued prohibiting all public gatherings. This order embraces all schools, picture shows, churches, lodges, including home gatherings. This order is a preventative of spread of the prevailing Spanish influenza. So that was the notice from W.J. Reynolds, the secretary of the Fayetteville Board of Health at that time. Okay, so 1 week later, on October the 16th, the University of Arkansas responded. What they ended up doing is 3 days later, I don't have it on this list, but 3 days later, they would extend their quarantine and keep canceling classes. And this one, you'll see this headline, one of the words was clipped off. Influenza patients are recovering at U of A. And at the bottom, you might be able to see this. There are 6 of the SAT soldiers died. And I want to know if you can see down there next to the last guy, his name is Harry Musgrove from McCrory, Arkansas. That's over northeast of Little Rock towards Memphis. He was our first person to die at the University of Arkansas from the influenza. One of the guys is from Oklahoma. The other 5 are from Arkansas in that list. I'll talk about that some more later. Anyway, okay, so 10 days later, and I guess maybe people were following the quarantine, small town, people can keep separated, whatever. The epidemic began to slow pretty rapidly. And by October the 28th, the U of A had dropped their quarantine and they had opened, and the paper reported there were 1,500 students. Now, I'm assuming there's still SATC guys in there because that's way more students than they had in the previous and following years. And then on November the 2nd, 1918, Fayetteville lifted the quarantine. So really that's pretty fast, October the 9th to November the 2nd, but they clamped down and they defeated it in wave number 2. Okay, so that's wave 2 is the one that hit here. It'll hit again, but wave 2 is the main one. Wave 2 is the main one all over the world. It killed hundreds of thousands, millions of people, hundreds of thousands of our troops, millions of people around the world. Anyway, so there was a wave 3. It started almost immediately, and you can see why it would. Immediately after Armistice, as soon as the war ended, all the soldiers came back, right? And here comes the influenza, exploded again in the winter of 1918 and lasted well into the spring of 1919. In fact, I know of one person who died in the summer of 1919, I believe, from the influenza, but the main wave was till late spring. Okay, so now we're back to the picture, and I don't want to belabor it by, you guys that know me know I I love these old pictures. And I don't know, by the way, if you see in the left-hand corner, there's a dark mark around these two fellows. I wish I knew why, but I don't. Anyway, if you look in the picture, I think you can see right here, there's a long line of soldiers. And according to some other pictures, there's 2 or 3 pictures from this day. And I believe that is based on that this is November 11th, 1918 in Fayetteville. There's a bunch of soldiers interspersed. They're all looking to the south, and there's people giving speeches. Probably Major Martin is giving one, and the mayor at the time. I'll talk about him later. And to orient you, for anybody not familiar or familiar with Fayetteville, because these buildings are all gone, this is the north side of the square. To the right, out of our sight, over here where my cursor is, that's where what we call is the old post office is now. It was only, in 1918, it was only 7 years old. And up above at the top right, you can see the clock from what is now the historic Washington County Courthouse, and it was only 12 years old, or 13 years old at the time. And I wanted to show you these buildings real quick. They're all gone now. This one over here was called the McElroy Building, not the bank, building. And that's where, if you're familiar with Fayetteville history, that was the Boston store for many years. Next to it is the Red Cross drugstore, which I'll get back to later. And then this building here, the darker one, the third one in, that's the actual McElroy Bank. I'm so old that I was actually in there. I was in there one time as a kid, a couple of times maybe. And this next one is the J.L. Duke jewelry store. And this bigger building here is a grocery store. And one other thing I'll point out here is this building that's kind of light, that's actually Buck's Drugstore in 1918. If you're familiar with the square, that's where the U of A Continuing Education Center is today. Just wanted to point out all those things to you. And this is, like I said, this is occurring, I believe, on exactly November 11th, 1918. So that's my little trip down a just pure history thing right there. Okay, and now this one I wanted to talk about a couple of people here, a couple of famous victims of the influenza back then. And the first one, and she was hit by the flu in wave 2 in October of 2018. I'm sorry, I should have said 1918. My bad. I just saw that for the first time. I've looked at this about 100 times. Anyway, that's Catherine Ann Porter, the writer, and she wrote a short novel, Pale Horse, Pale Rider, about her experience. And I wanted to point it out because I read the book, I read the novella, and it is really scary. She was so sick. She was in the hospital for 6 months, and she was deathly ill. And a young soldier who took care of her actually got it too and died. It's a pretty tragic story. But anyway, at the time, she was a newspaper reporter in Denver for the Rocky Mountain News, and she got this. Anyway, so when she recovered, she wrote this novella about it. And it's, boy, if you want to read something that really tells you what it's like, she does. And fortunately for her, even though she had had bad health before, you can see by her dates, she lived to be 90 years old. So the influenza, as hard as it was on her, it was really rough on her. Her hair turned completely white from it. She lived and was able to have a long, productive life. Now, the second person I want to talk about was President Woodrow Wilson. President Wilson had been in Paris since December of 1918, the longest any president's ever been out of the United States, for the Paris peace talks to try to end World War I. And in April of 1919, President Wilson got the influenza really, really badly, and he almost died. But he recovered. But that fall, he had a stroke, which was, pretty much debilitating. And he finished his term, but you can see he died in 1924, only 5 years later, 67, 68 years old. And most people I read think that the influenza contributed to his earlier death than he should have had. I'm going to talk about what's that called? lifespan shortening later on. It was unbelievable. When I get done here, I want to do that real quick. Okay, so now those were the two people I want to talk about. There was a fourth wave, early 1920. Some people don't recognize this, but a lot of people do. It's probably 50-50. But there was a fourth wave in early 1920, and it hit Fayetteville. So we, on February the 1st, Fayetteville had to go into our second quarantine, the same thing. You know, no churches, no schools, no restaurants, theaters, no meetings, and so forth. Now, interestingly enough, this one, there was no SATC by then. They had disbanded, you know, after the war, and they had gone back to the ROTC programs on campuses. But the U of A, there was no quarantine, but the U of A had their own measures, which they said, I'm sure the kids love this, no dating, no parties, no getting together of any kind, and they had to have the passes to get off. And they were also discouraged from going into Fayetteville. Anyway, so now this case, it's the process is interesting because on 2 days later, on February 3rd, the paper reports 57 cases in town. By 2 days later, there's 129 cases in town. Remember, there's only, you know, probably by now 5,200 people in town. And on February the 9th, there are 150 cases in town and 1,000 in Arkansas. And then, oh, by the way, I just wanted this picture. You can see people masked up back in the day. One of the problems they said, I may touch on that again later, is that the masks of the time, they used them, but they were made of gauze, so they weren't as effective as the ones we've been using now. But these ladies are conductorettes. I had to look that up. They help people on the trolley cars and on the subway. They help you get on and off those. I thought that was interesting. Conductorettes. So anyway, February 9th, there's 150 cases in town. But 6 days later, the second quarantine is lifted. So it only lasted 2 weeks, and they got rid of that one. And I think, yeah, okay, so the second one, my second slide about the 1920 pandemic, the brief one. The University of Arkansas chemistry professor, Harrison Hale. This picture, by the way, this is one of those processes by elimination from the annuals. I kept finding pictures of Harrison Hale until the only Harrison Hale in the picture that was the same in the other was this guy. So if it's not Harrison Hale, forgive me, but I'm pretty sure it is. Anyway, so Professor Hale, February 2nd, started doing his own tests using a chlorine gas mixture, and he took only university volunteers, and he did 5-minute sessions, most of them daily. And down here on the left is a picture, on the right's him. On the left is an article he wrote. My friend Charlie Allison told me about this, and miracle of miracles, this was actually online, and this is the entire article right here in the Journal of Industrial and Engineering Chemistry in April of 1920. But anyway, Professor Hale was doing these 5-minute daily sessions with people as a preventative, not as a cure, but as a preventive to the virus. So he went from the 2nd to the 9th, and he did 800 treatments with 184 individuals, all connected to the University of Arkansas, including children. And then, and this is, I want to point out here that my research here is not done. There are holes in the research, and one of them is right here. Professor Hale said, because of a sudden rapid improvement in the local situation, he stopped his experiments. I'm going, what sudden rapid improvement? I don't have any information about that. But anyway, oddly enough, he stopped on the very day when the numbers peaked out, which is a number he gives himself in this article here. But anyway, you can actually go online. If you did like a Google search, you can read this article yourself. What he did was, if I got my notes here, he used 1,000th of 1% of chlorine gas, and it was blown into the room by electric fans, and people would inhale that for 5 minutes. And anyway, he felt it was pretty effective. He said the only person that got the flu was somebody he believed already had it. So hopefully it really did work, but I don't know if we know for sure. Anyway, so that takes us through there. And then I wanted to give you some slides here on what I'm calling these 3 slides called Fighting the Influenza. and the first one I'm calling a familiar approach. So back then, they did isolation just like we're doing now. They call it self-distancing, and they said 5 feet, and we say 6 feet. They did have quarantine. We have shelter in place and stay in place, stay at home kind of thing, similar, although not a real quarantine. They also recommend, as we do today, fresh air, sunlight, good hygiene, and reusable face masks. Although, like I told you, the commentators think that those gauze masks they had then were not terribly effective, not as good as ours. Tim, did you need to say something? Anyway, that's pretty much the same as today. And then, anyway, so now we have widespread testing, which they did not have then. We have much better facilities and treatment, 100 years of advancement in medical science, and we have an effective vaccine. Now, I should point out there was a vaccine tried at the time in 1918, but it was a vaccine for bacteria, and it did not have any effect on this whatsoever. One doctor later on said we were 100% wrong to use it. Anyway, so I left a couple of things here just for you to see from the time. I wanted to have visuals as much as I could at different time. You see the one on the left, influenza spread by droplets sprayed from nose and throat. That's exactly what we hear today. Spread by contact, avoid crowds, don't use common drinking cups, so forth. All that sort of stuff, exactly the same. And the second one, I wanted you to see that. It says, stamp out the Spanish influenza or flu plague in Portland. That's from Oregon. And notice the mask the guy's got. It kind of looks, of course, one side is up to his mouth, it looks like, and the other side's over the top like a duck's beak or something. One of the oddest ones I've seen. So that was the fighting the influenza familiar approach. And I wanted you to see over-the-counter things. I find these things really interesting to see what was available in 1918 for people or what they were pushing at the pharmacies. On the left, you'll see one to prevent it. Dobell solution, I'll have to look these things up. That was some kind of a nasal spray, sodium bicarbonate and glycerol and other ingredients. Quinine, which of course would make sense to them because quinine is always used for malaria, which has the same symptoms, right? High fever, chills, that sort of thing. And bone set tea, I had to look, I'd never seen that in my life. It's a plant, a really pretty plant, white plant. And they use that for a tea for pain as well. I looked at a video about it. They use it for fevers and pain as well. Anyway, and so, oh, and I'm sorry, I jumped past the other. The next one over there is for 50 cents a box. You can get the cinnamon and quinine capsule. I guess that makes them taste better. Down in the bottom left, we got this cascara quinine, and I had to look that up. Cascara is the skin of the coffee cherry that has the coffee bean inside. You can look that up. I did not know that before. The second one talks about pasteurized milk. At this time, in studying this, there was a big debate going on because there was so much raw milk being consumed in those days, right off the farm, and pasteurized milk was just becoming a thing. And they wanted to make sure the pasteurized milk was safer for you, eliminated things that could cause diseases and so forth. So for your overall better health, they were recommending that you drink pasteurized milk. Of course, that was beneficial for the guys that were making pasteurized milk too. And then part of the reason I showed you that picture from the north side of the square in the Red Cross drugstore is here's an ad directly from the Red Cross drugstore for a nasal spray called Iofine, cough medicine rather, it's a cough medicine, and it had codeine in it, 50 cents a bottle. What I didn't talk about was that the doctors had a lot of prescriptions for things too, and almost all of them were opiates, so they were really powerful and they were restricted. I just wanted to show you what people could go down to the drugstore and buy when they were trying to get through this. And then the third and last of the fighting the influenza slides is I wanted to show you the leaders in Fayetteville at the time. There's Dr. Yates, who was the city health officer. He was W.J. Reynolds was the one that issued the order, but he was the head officer at the time. This next fellow, Dr. E.F. Ellis, was later on chief of staff at the city hospital. Here's another hole in the research. is I know that 2 people died at City Hospital, but I don't know about others. I don't know what all went on at City Hospital because I can't get to those documents right now, unfortunately. But anyway, Dr. Ellis is a really famous doctor in Fayetteville, and he was one of the people treating patients at the time. And then the third person I wanted to show you was Alan Wilson. He was the mayor at the time. In the 1920, when it was J.T. Phillips was the mayor. But Alan Wilson is the grandson of one of the A.M. Wilson, who was one of the, if not a settler of Fayetteville, consider one of the founding fathers, if you will. And if you're familiar with Wilson Park in Fayetteville, that's this family. That's the reason we have Wilson Park, is it comes from this group of people. The A.M. Wilson home is where the Pi-Fi house is at Maple and Wilson, if you're familiar with Fayetteville, up by the university. Okay, so now we get to what were the final numbers. Again, I'm going to show you the variables here. Worldwide, the estimates 22, 30, 50 million or more out of a population of 1.8 billion. I didn't do the percentage because I'm not good at that math at that level. I'm not good at getting the percentage, but it was a very high one. The mortality rate on the Spanish influenza in 1918 was 2.5%. Normally it's 0.1%, so it's 25 times worse, the mortality rate, the death rate, than the usual influenza that we get. The COVID one, the last I saw was, I believe, 1.7%, which is very high. And anyway, the United States, the Spanish influenza, the 1918 influenza, we lost somewhere between 500, 650, and 675,000 people out of a population of 103 million. And right now with COVID-19, I believe that we're at 350,000 deaths out of 331 million. So it's less, but given 100 years of medical advancement, I'm not sure that's a very good number, to be honest with you. That's my opinion. Okay, Arkansas's numbers are a little more concrete. They said that 7,000 people died in the state out of a population of 1.7 million. And on the U of A, there's a document I have that's online. You can find it called In Memory of Those Who Fell During World War I. And in there, they list 12 SAT soldiers who died at the University of Arkansas campus, 9 from Arkansas and 3 from Oklahoma. And looking, and I'll talk about them just briefly in a minute, and looking at the U of A history books, Professor Hale, who actually went through this, only lists those only 6 dead, like in the newspaper at the time, and there were actually 12. Robert Leffler in his book listed 11 and 12, but the university did a really good job. Charlie Allison put that document up there, and I think Lisa Childs did the documenting of the numbers. Anyway, and then in that document also, you'll see if you look at it, there's at least 5 more U of A students who died of the influenza other places. And now this doesn't even take into account military guys that died, gone. We don't know, how many of those may have been from town and so forth. Again, Fayetteville, once again, I feel really limited here. I've only been able to find 3 people. One of those is a little baby named Carter. And the paper, it's not even conclusive. The newspaper says his mother was really, really sick and his family was really sick and the baby died. So the implication is the baby died of the influenza. There are 2 men that died of it. One guy worked at the University of Arkansas for that SATC in the canteen, which is one of their little cafes, restaurant type thing. And he may have been, I don't know this, he may have been the source that spread the amount into Fayetteville itself. I don't know that. I don't want to blame him. And then there's another man that died in Fayetteville. That's all I know in Fayetteville specifically. The 2 men did die at City Hospital. I know that. Now, I ran into another article that said that 5 physicians from the Fort Smith and Fayetteville area died treating people. I found another document that said 3 of those died in Fort Smith, so that would mean 2 in Fayetteville died. I do not know who they are. And again, that's a hole in the research that has to be filled at some stage to find out who those people were. So that's like the kind of final numbers thing on this. But one of the things I want to do, I've got on my sheet of paper, is two more things I want to point out while we're here. Kind of a couple of stunning things to me. In 1917, the average lifespan for American people, men, was 48 years and women 54 years, which is really low compared to today. But the 1918 lifespan, because of the influenza, was men 36 years and women 42. That is absolutely stunning to me, the drop in life expectancy. Which brings me to another point. They talk about the most people died in America at least, and probably everywhere, of the influenza 1918 in the 20 to 46 range. Like now with COVID, we worry about 60 and above and little kids sort of thing. Or I'm not sure that the children are worried about the older people, but in this day, the 20 to 46, and I find it odd that none of the books or anybody said it, but it's obvious, isn't it? That it's because the soldiers all died from it. So many soldiers died. That's why, because they're young men. They're like 18 to 23 years old. And that's, I'm sure, why that life expectancy dropped so much. Anyway, one more thing here is the World War I deaths. I wanted to show you how horrible this was. In World War I, the United States lost 116,176 men died. 53,000, a little over 53,000 died in combat or from results of wounds in combat and so forth. 63,000 died of influenza. So even though it was kind of ignored at the time, the influenza actually killed, that's 10,000 more men in World War I than combat did. That's how bad this thing was. Okay, and then my final slide with information here is I wanted to show you, in case you were interested in pursuing this, books and articles about the 1918 influenza. You can see the titles there. I've highlighted two of them. The American Pandemic by Nancy K. Bristow, because she talks about this. Yeah, Austin, Austin asked, are any more how the education system in Arkansas was affected by the pandemic. I do know what happened in Fayetteville. I'm not sure around, they shut the schools down, and when they opened them back up, the Fayetteville school system went to 6 days a week. They went through Monday through Saturday to make up for the time lost during the quarantines. And they also only took off 1 day for Christmas and 1 day for New Year's to catch back up. And I think the U of A may have done something similar. I can't remember off the top of my head. Was that good, Austin? Was that enough information?
I'm amazed how we're not any much different today than we were 100 years ago.
Yeah, Larry, I agree with you there. It's kind of unbelievable, isn't it?
All we have is IVs now, just about, and a lot of medicine we're playing with. And
the vaccine, I think, is going to be the big thing for us.
Oh, yeah. Well, I really congratulate you on your presentation.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. L-Pence says, well, the schools were segregated. Yes, the schools were definitely segregated. And that, by the way, that's another area I'll be looking for when I do my more extensive research on on local research, is I'll be looking to see how this impacted our Black community.
How long have you been working on this?
I started, well, here's the deal, Larry, is I actually had run into this years ago. I was doing research on an article I wrote about the old theaters in Fayetteville. And by accident, I saw this and went, holy cow. I didn't know there was a quarantine back here and everything. So I had seen the quarantine and the 1921 and all that. So I knew about it. So then when this pandemic started, I started kind of gearing up. And by last May, I had given a talk for the Washington County Historical Society on it.
My daddy lived in a little old cabin west of Imboden, and he was 18 years old. And the doctor came out on horseback to see him. He was real sick, and when he left, he remembered he was able to hear him tell his daddy, I don't expect him to be alive in the morning.
Wow.
And he lived to be 99. He graduated the university.
Good for him.
Degree the year.
Yeah,
master's a year before I got my bachelor's.
Good for him. Good for him. there's a lot of, quite a few stories like that of people being told they were, well, the lady, Catherine Ann Porter, she was in a state she didn't care whether she lived or died. She was so sick, she didn't even care, and they thought she was gone too.
Does Dr. Dillahay have any information from you on this? This is really interesting. And the governor, if he doesn't know about it, he ought to have it. Have a copy.
Yeah, well, one of the things I try to do without getting too much into it is there are pretty clear parallels, and the time frame actually, the details are different. The COVID-19 and the 1918 influenza are different, but the time frames we're kind of running exactly on the time frames. Now, this spike here is more in line with wave 3 of the 1918 influenza. It's kind of our wave 2, if you will. But it's kind of running the same course. And I'm hoping, as I said a little bit before, Larry, I'm hoping that the vaccine, if everybody can get the vaccine, that it's going to help kill this thing off within a few months, hopefully.
Well, I thought that our people kept talking about these recurrences, or they just had some kind of a crystal ball. But did they have knowledge of how this happened back then that they're correlating this with, or how are they knowledgeable that we're going to have a surge? We had it back in 18, but I didn't know about it.
Yeah, you mean, in 2018 or 1918?
1918.
Yeah, no, they did not know at that time. It's the later commentators that have discovered all this stuff that gives you that idea, and now they predict. Actually, I think of it, I recall somebody predicted like in either 2016 or 2017 that this was going to happen, that it was about due for. Now, most of them are lesser pandemics, and the death rate is like, 0.1%, and they get stopped after a few months and so forth. But, this is like the 100-year kind of thing. If you go online, you can look. I have a list here somewhere. Just do a list on worldwide pandemics over time. It's unbelievable how many of these things have happened over the course of mankind's history. Of course, the worst being that horrifying bubonic plague, the Black Death, which killed estimates of 25% of the people in Europe, which is an unbelievable number.
Well, I just thought these people were smart, but maybe they knew a little bit of what happened there 100 years ago and were able to make these predictions.
Well, the guys, the people studying now, I have to say this right now, I'm so impressed by the people that study this now and the way they've come up with a vaccine and reaction, how to fix the reactions to it and so forth. But they have looked back because these viruses, as I understand it, never actually go away. And so they can study them and they can learn about them and they can predict and that sort of thing. And I think they've just done a spectacular job in those labs of finding out what this is and what to do about it. Because, average person, this is not like a bacteria that will, you can make it go away right away because it's a living organism. I think of these things as almost alien beings of some kind. Yeah, they just don't, the viruses are, they're just alien to me.
I'm amazed that people try to tell us that history is not important. It's probably one of the most important things we've got going other than English and arithmetic.
Yeah, you won't get an argument from me there. That's I don't understand. Well, I don't want to get into all that too much, but I always say if you don't know where you came from, you're not going to know who you are, and not likely going to know where you're going.
I didn't appreciate that till I was about 40 years old, but I did.
Exactly the same with me, Larry. Exactly the same. I was in my 40s before the little light bulb went on above my head. And you-hoo, dummy. Tim, do you have anything to add there?
Hey, Jerry, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Sorry, I got kicked off my laptop, and so I had to, and it wouldn't let me connect back on, so I'm on my phone right now.
I was wondering where you were. I got off and I says, Tim?
Yeah, about that. As Tom Dillard always says, technology will always let you down.
Yeah.
We did have a question or earlier in the chat about the title of your book, and I wanted to make sure that I got it right. Forgotten Fayetteville in Washington County, and that's supposed to come out in October of this year?
Yes, it is. I actually typed that in the chat, Tim,
Okay.
and mentioned it as
Okay.
well. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, we
And
have a couple other
who's-
questions too.
who's publishing that, Jerry?
That's Ogma Creative Media. They're my publisher.
Okay.
They do my, poetry fiction and nonfiction. They do everything I do.
Good. Good. Well, I think we are. If no one has any other questions, I can't see who has. I can't see the chat on my phone.
Oh, well, we had a question, Tim, about the education system, which I hope I answered at least locally. And then we had a question asking if schools were segregated, and I said, yes, they were. And I need to study that when I get a chance to see the impact on our Black community here. And then, Joanna Ferre just said, informative, interesting, and thank you. And I thank her for that.
Well, we appreciate having you here today, tonight, Jerry. And we're at 8 o'clock, and I always try to keep everyone on time and in. But if anyone has any other questions, I'll give you a couple of minutes to type it in, and then we'll say goodnight if there aren't any.
Well, thanks, Tim. You know I always take up my time.
Well, I'm glad you did, because it was you don't know how frustrating it is trying to get connected, and you can't get connected back on, and then I knew they were waiting on me to come back on.
Yeah, that was a shock to me. I'm going, where's Tim? Where did Tim go?
Well, I'm sure you handled it just fine, like you
I
always.
said, I've lost my host.
Well, I will remind everyone that the next stay-at-home lecture is going to be on February 4th, and I will be presenting on Dr. J.H. Smith, who was a African-American dentist in Little Rock in the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s. So
That'll be interesting.
And it'll be the same link as you used tonight. It'll be posted on Facebook, and I'll send out emails as I usually do. So, Jerry, we really appreciate having you here tonight.
Thank you, Tim, and thanks to everybody that's hanging around for the talk. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you next month.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Good night. Good
Bye.
night.